This is Asia News Weekly, the podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. What exactly will be the fallout from Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's speech? I break down the speech and call out those who need to be. Plus, if you're having problems wrapping your head around China's economic woes, Curtis S. Chin breaks down what and why things are happening. These stories and more are next. Greetings and salutations, my excellent friends. Great to have you here with me on this Friday, August 21st, 2015. I am Steve Miller, your host. Now, before we dive into this week's podcast, one program note. The new academic term is just around the corner, begins on August 31st here in South Korea, and as a university professor, I need to prepare for my classes. That means I need to take a little time off to prepare for my students, so there won't be any podcasts the next couple of weeks. I will resume normal podcasting schedules in September. Now, until then, I do plan to update the Facebook and Twitter feeds for Asia News Weekly, and if I have some extra time, I will release a small podcast in the interim. All right, now that that is out of the way, let's get to the news. While recording last week's podcast, rough details emerged of the massive explosions that rocked Tianjin, China. In the week since, there has been a steady release of information, and here's what we've learned this week. During the initial portion of the week, the death toll from the blast continued to rise, but now has tapered off. Currently, it stands at 114 fatalities, with 100 or so missing and over 700 injured. Many of those that perished in the blast were actually first responders or firefighters sent in to contain the blast site. Search and recovery operations continued throughout the early portion of the week. It took 2 full days for firefighters to put out the fires spawned by the explosions. During that time, authorities created an evacuation zone measuring 3 kilometers from ground zero. Some 6,000 residents have been displaced, many of whom feel as if the government has forgotten about them. Media outlets are also reporting damage to more than 8,000 cars that were in the port area affected by the blast, and damage to the vehicles from the explosions is estimated to be in the neighborhood of $1.5 billion. Tianjin plays a major role in China's import of cars. About 55% of all vehicles entering China go through the port city. Renault was one of the companies affected by the explosion, which resulted in the loss of about 1,500 cars, and they believe this explosion will cause a 5% deficit for their dealers. However, Hyundai and Kia Motors lost about 4,000 cars combined. Around 3,000 tons of highly hazardous chemicals were stored at the Tianjin site. Roughly 700 tons of sodium cyanide were located in 2 separate areas inside the blast zone. In addition, 800 tons of ammonium nitrate and 500 tons of potassium nitrate were also listed among the 40 chemicals reportedly there. Because sodium cyanide can form a flammable gas upon contact with water, its presence is especially alarming given its large quantity. Protective measures were put in place, like walls and drain covers, to prevent further catastrophes, but it was unclear if rain falling would spread the toxic chemicals. Some 3,000 soldiers were dispatched to the area to clean up and contain the damage. Greenpeace conducted their own studies at several locations and didn't find any high levels of cyanide contamination, but they did recommend a comprehensive survey to ensure public safety. Unfortunately, the cause of the blast has yet to be determined, but there were reports of past safety violations a few years ago. Given that some chemicals stored on site were well above safety regulations, it appears safety protocols were once again breached. As more information becomes available about the blast, I'll be sure to update the Asia News Weekly Facebook and Twitter feeds. Immediately following Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's speech on the 70th anniversary of World War II, the world voiced their opinion. The White House released their statement, which read in part, "We welcome Prime Minister Abe's expression of deep remorse for the suffering caused by Japan during the World War II era, as well as his commitment to uphold past Japanese government statements on history. We also value Prime Minister Abe's assurances of Japan's intent to expand upon its contributions to international peace and prosperity in the years ahead. For 70 years, Japan has demonstrated an abiding commitment to peace, democracy, and the rule of law. This record stands as a model for nations everywhere." Peter Kuznick, a history professor at American University in Washington, D.C., called Abe a notorious historical falsifier. Abe's remarks are a bland statement that neither accepts responsibility for Japan's past aggression in a way that will satisfy China, the Koreas, and other victims of Japanese atrocities, nor does it infuriate Japan's right-wing nationalists who form the backbone of Abe's supporters. He is remilitarizing Japan. He is effectively consigning Japan's peace constitution to the dustbin of history, which understandably alarms all of Japan's neighbors. Those are two very different opinions of the Prime Minister's remarks, and like everything in life, one must peel through multiple layers to get close to the truth. So let's take a look at these layers. Let's take a look at the speech. Now, when you look at the language that Prime Minister Abe used, it is exactly 100% what one should have expected. It's actually what he said he was going to do. The speech itself was written for domestic audiences. It was written for his supporters. And anyone who takes a look at the actual speech itself can see that. It's who he needs to play to. In fact, Abe also was sure to include language that would satisfy the United States. The people who he does not care about would be those overseas, namely those in Beijing and China, and Seoul and South Korea. And really, why would he? Placating Seoul, placating Beijing doesn't help him. Abe said there would be no new apology, and he stuck to his guns. And you know what? This will probably actually help him in the long run, because he'll be seen as someone who does not capitulate to outside influences. Now, what Abe said with regard to history and war was just enough to make the United States happy. It's also not going to anger anyone in the Nippon Keigi, which is a very right-wing revisionist group that Abe is affiliated with. Like Abe, this group feels that Japan has done absolutely nothing wrong with regards to its past activities. Sadly, the United States needs Japan in the region, so they also are not going to call Abe out, at least not directly. Okay, now with Abe not issuing a new apology, China and South Korea have said they will start judging Japan on its actions. Come on. This is something that I said way back in 2013. Apologies with no actions are not apologies. When someone apologizes, the person who receives that apology has the power to determine whether or not the apology is valid. If there are no actions to accompany those words, then in fact, the apology is empty. Empty words were spoken. South Korea and China need to stop asking for apologies. If you look over the past 70 years, Japan has issued more than 50 apologies since the end of the war. Now, if you're continuously asking for new apologies, then you seem to believe that the past apologies, the past words that were uttered are not sufficient. It's time to demand action, not more words, because Japan can continuously keep uttering apologies, keep uttering words, but after 70 years, no one is happy. So why keep on doing it? Japan committed horrific atrocities during the war and needs to face that fact head on. It, as a nation, needs to look squarely at the past and tear down anything that remotely justifies the warmongering that took place. South Korea and China also need to draw up a list of actions and hold Japan accountable on making progress towards those tasks. The time for apologies has long gone, and to many, the incessant calls for new apologies sounds like whining. So while we're on the subject of history, let's talk about the Yasukuni Shrine. Immediately following the World War II address the next day on August 15th, a couple of lawmakers went there. Abe made his ritual offering, and even his wife went there over the weekend. The knee-jerk reactions from Beijing and Seoul also need to stop. Their reactions don't help the situation. Yes, there are war criminals enshrined at Yasukuni. And yeah, when Abe sends an offering or anyone affiliated with the Nippon Keigi goes to the Yasukuni Shrine, they probably are honoring those war criminals. But you know what? There is no alternative in place to honor everyone else who is enshrined there. Remember, bus drivers, school teachers, animals are also enshrined at Yasukuni. The souls of everyone who died in service of the emperor dating back to the Meiji era is there. And their souls can't be ripped out of the shrine and put someplace else. People aren't going to stop going to the shrine because it has a huge significance. So a more constructive way needs to be developed to deal with this. And I think a good place to start would be to tear down the Yushukan, or the blatant propaganda museum that sits on the shrine's grounds. For me, that would be a huge step in the right direction. Unfortunately, even if Japan started on these particular tasks, it may not be enough to improve relations. There is a deep resentment against Japan that to some extent has been adopted as part of China's and South Korea's national identity. Now, this doesn't typically extend to a Japanese citizen, but does extend towards the government and its policies. And this is what I mean by that. If a politician in South Korea experiences a little hiccup, they simply need to blame Japan, and their rankings in the polls will go up. That, my friends, is equally as bad and does absolutely nothing to move the dialogue forward. So let us not forget that despite all of this squabbling, these three East Asian powerhouses have an extremely functional working relationship. And a lot of what we see is theatrics. All right, I've said my piece, I've shared my opinion, and now I'd love to hear yours. So please, don't be shy and speak up. China has the world's second largest economy, but even then, it's only a little more than half of the United States GDP. According to CNN Money, the figures for 2015 put the Chinese economy at 11.2 trillion US dollars, way ahead of number 3 Japan, who comes in at just 4.2 trillion US dollars. But things haven't been going all that well for Beijing. Its markets took a dive, then China elected to devalue its currency. The dip in key Chinese indices were felt across Asia, as well as the yuan's dip. But what does it all mean? Returning to the podcast is Curtis S. Chin, Asia Fellow with the Milken Institute, to help unpack everything.
When we look at China today, from the stock markets to what the Chinese government has recently done with its currency, clearly the message is China is still struggling how to make that transition to free markets, to a more open system. So we look back at what's happened in China these last couple of weeks. Clearly the headlines of, let's say, a month ago were really record drops in the Hong Kong or in the Chinese stock market, specifically in Shanghai and Shenzhen. One response was that the Chinese government intervened. But let's take a step back. Why did the markets drop? A whole lot of speculation out there. But I think fundamentally we're looking at an issue of where regular mom and pop Chinese investors began to have questions about the sustainability of China's growth story. And you can understand that when you look at the numbers coming out of China today. Even more recently, we saw the Chinese government devalue its currency, which followed not so great trade figures from China. So whether it's the Chinese stock market declining by significant amounts, or the Chinese government's interventions into its own kind of currency and the exchange rate, I think what we're looking at now is doubts about the sustainability of the Chinese growth model. Unfortunately, I think what China has done is in a way undercut a longer term confidence in the China market. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago, let's say, when Xi Jinping took power, there was a lot of conversations about putting greater kind of trust in the power of markets, that through markets, through market forces, China would move forward. Unfortunately, in this last month, we've seen perhaps, a little doubt come into the minds of the Chinese leadership about that. Interventions in the stock market, the devaluation of the Chinese renminbi, the Chinese yuan, all examples of perhaps a government that's a little bit less confident in the power of market forces alone to move China forward. I think that's unfortunate. In the long term, what China needs is less interventionism and more reforms and more trust in the ability of the own Chinese people, of the Chinese market, to allocate resources, to allocate investment dollars, and provide opportunity for Chinese companies to create jobs and growth for the overall country.
Well, let's talk about that intervention. I mean, they significantly played with the stock market to try and get it to stop sliding. I mean, was that a good idea, or did in fact they make things worse in the long run, like you mentioned a moment ago?
Yes, the Chinese government clearly intervened in an unprecedented way in its own markets, specifically the Shanghai and Shenzhen markets. What does that mean? It means that they stopped people even from selling shares. Think about that. If you're an investor, I'm investing in the Chinese market, in a Chinese company, with the hopes that, of course, it's going to grow. But if I think that maybe I want to put my money elsewhere in any normal situation, well, then I would sell that share and maybe invest in another. But now you're prevented from selling your shares. So if you think about the future, why would you ever want to invest again? If there's a difficult situation, you're trying to understand what's going on, you've decided, I'm going to shift my money elsewhere. The Chinese government might, as they have done recently, say, well, no, you're not going to do that because we don't want the stock market to go down. Other interventions have been including stop or investigating what they think is, in their words, kind of malicious activities. And clearly people need to obey the law when they're investing or taking part in any market. But the Chinese government, I felt, has overreacted. But when you think about why, it perhaps isn't simply because they're worried about mom and pop people losing their money, which is a terrible thing. What they're probably most worried about is how do we ensure stability for China in the long run. So if too many people are worried about and have not a lot of confidence in what the Chinese government is doing, that's not a good thing. And so let's look at more examples of this. More recently, the Chinese intervention into their currency markets, devaluing the currencies. And so what that means is that, say, if you're a Chinese citizen, goods and services from overseas are now going to cost more money, because your renminbi, your Chinese currency, is worth less than what it was before. Certainly that might be good for people who want to buy products from China. That might be good if you're a Chinese citizen and you're spending money only in China on Chinese products and services. But that's not how the world works today. And then even more, I would say more sadly, but certainly more strikingly, let's look what happened in Tianjin. Tianjin, a terrible explosion took place, killing so many people there. Investigations continue into what happened in Tianjin, but now what we're seeing is that the Chinese government is thinking through, what can the media say about it? Because again, what they're probably most worried about, as with the Chinese stock market, as with issues related to Chinese currency and what's happening to Chinese companies, what they're worried about is the long-term stability of their country, and that's understandable. But if people all of a sudden are complaining about how come I'm not getting information on what happened in Tianjin, if people are complaining about how come my investment in the Chinese stock markets has gone down, if people are complaining about how come I can't be exporting more products, the value of the renminbi seems to be higher than we'd want it to be. Clearly, China is responding. But all of this, when we look at it together, I think says to people who look at China, that perhaps China is a little bit less confident in what is going on in China than the numbers might otherwise say. And that brings us actually to a very important point. When we look at China, do we really believe the economic coming out of that country? I think we got to look at all kinds of numbers to get a sense of it. So it's not simply the GDP figure that China might announce. We have to look at things like how much electricity is being used, all those other indicators that might give a better sense of how good the Chinese economy is doing today.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because what happens in the market, what happens with a currency doesn't necessarily mean the exact same thing is happening to the economy. So is there something truly to be concerned about with the Chinese economic status as we see it today?
Indeed, I think there is. When China slows, really Asia slows also. China is such an important part of the Asia-Pacific
Well,
marketplace.
you're absolutely
And so,
right. I mean, because as we saw the Chinese markets drop, as we saw the yuan drop, that cascaded all over Asia.
absolutely, absolutely. And so, your question was really about, what is the progress, what is the prognosis for the Chinese market? Again, I think the Chinese government is struggling to maintain a growth figure, which maybe is down to lower than 7%. But you raise an important point: the difference between, say, the Chinese stock market and the daily life of an average person. I think the same with the United States with the global financial crisis. There's always that question: is what is happening on Wall Street of relevance to Main Street? And I think that's an important question when we also look at China today. Is what is happening in the Chinese Shanghai and Shenzhen stock markets important to what is happening in the Chinese version of Main Street? And I would say not directly, in the sense that really there aren't that many people, when you look at the 1.2 billion, 1.3 billion people in China who are actually invested in those stock markets. But indirectly, it's very important because it goes to what is the confidence people have as to what is going on in China today. And so that goes back also to perhaps one reason the Chinese government is fast and furiously really trying to control what their own citizens understand and what they hear about what is going on in their own economy. And, outsiders were even more removed. There are actually a lot of protests going on in China that maybe don't make our newscast here I'm living in Thailand right now, in Singapore, where I work, or back in the United States. We don't really see what's going on day to day, what's going on in China. And the reality might be that the average Chinese actually doesn't see day to day what's going on in that vast country, in that vast economy that is China today.
All right, one last question. China's trying to get the AIIB off the ground. It's heavily invested and involved with the BRICS Bank. Is the devaluation of the yuan or the sliding stock market going to affect either of those two entities?
I'd say no. When we think about China, when we think about things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, when we think about this new development bank put together by the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, these are long-term plays. And I think, to their great credit, these initiatives, these institutions aren't about daily fluctuations on the stock market. It isn't about a daily exchange rate or the interventions into an exchange rate. What these institutions are about is kind of a sign that the global financial infrastructure is changing. And that reflects the reality of economies today. I saw one statistic recently that had the developed economies, I think lower, it might have been 42%, but was certainly lower than 50% of the global GDP. And I think that's a reflection of the reality today, which is a good thing, that the world is growing. My hope is that, we look at these statistics of, GDP from the developing world, the emerging world versus the developed economies. One day, it'll all be one global developed economy. And that's far from the situation today. So when we look at individual countries that are growing, like a China, let's keep in mind China is still growing. It's just not at that growth rate that had one time dominated all the headlines. That as China continues to grow, understandably, the Chinese government will say, well, shouldn't that be reflected in global financial institutions, in their shareholding, in their leadership? And so things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, I think these are efforts that are understandable, that some of the countries behind them are pushing them to reflect the changing global economy. That's a good thing. But I would say, as these institutions emerge, let's hope it's not a race to the bottom when it comes to global standards, when it comes to safeguards for indigenous peoples, for people that are impacted by the projects of these institutions. That as these institutions emerge and as they develop, let's hope they come together, elevating everything around the world to better protections of our environment, to better protections of people impacted by the project. That will be for a good thing. When the AIB was announced, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether it would actually happen. But look how fast it's happened. I think that's a terrific thing. But now the devil, as they say, is always in the details. What will this AIIB actually do? How will it always operate, or how will it operate as it goes forward? And I think it's appropriate for the world to be watchful of that. But hopefully, let's hope the world engages and makes that institution a much stronger bank than it would otherwise have been had it just simply been a Chinese bank. So I'm hopeful.
All right. Thank you so much. Curtis Chin with the Milken Institute, thank you again for your time this week.
Always great to be with you.
Have you felt the pinch of the devalued yuan? I know I have. Here in South Korea, the won has decreased in value against the US dollar and made my overseas purchases significantly more expensive. But I would love to hear from you. Do you have any stories to share? If you do, be sure to drop them in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. The horrific bomb blast that exploded Monday evening at the Erewhon Shrine in Bangkok has claimed the life of 20 people and injured well over 100. The following day, another explosive was hurled off a pier, and thankfully, no one that time was injured. Authorities are now searching for a man caught on CCTV wearing a yellow shirt. They believe he may be affiliated with an anti-government group and want to know why he went into the shrine, took off his backpack, and then left. With me now is the Milken Institute's Asia Fellow, Curtis S. Chin, who resides in Bangkok. Curtis, how are you doing?
Doing well. It's certainly a crazy time. One of my friends, Steve Herman, a reporter with Voice of America, described Bangkok.
Well,
yeah, Steve said Bangkok is really a city on edge. And that's what it is. At the time of the really unfortunate incident this past Monday, I was actually in Kuala Lumpur, and sadly Malaysia lost 4 or 5 people, including from a single family. So a very sad time here in Bangkok, clearly a city on edge. But Thailand has been through tough times before. My hope certainly is, again, that Thailand will quickly recover. But clearly we're seeing the impact of Monday's bombings, of course the one we most know about, the terrible happenings at the Erewhon Shrine. But there was another incident, a bomb thrown off of a bridge to a pier, which luckily for everyone exploded in the river, and so no one was harmed. But these two incidents have clearly taken their impact on the financials, on what are people thinking of Thailand right now. Stock market is down. I think the Thai baht to US dollar exchange rate is the lowest in I think almost 6 years. So clearly people understandably are worried.
Right, and they've released the sketch of the individual who are they're searching for, the man in the yellow shirt. Is that at all putting at ease people's mind that the government, that the authorities are actually on top of things?
Of course, people will have different opinions on this, but, from my own perspective, spending quite a bit of time in Bangkok, one as a kid and now back in Bangkok as an adult, people want to know things are happening, that they have someone they're looking for, and clearly there is some reassurance in that. But we'll see how the investigation plays out. I hate to just, be part of all that speculation of who did what here. I have to have some confidence in the authorities, and my hope is that if needed, they will reach out to other governments. I know the United States, the United Kingdom, and certainly other countries have offered their assistance should the Thai government choose to take advantage of that. But clearly that investigation is an ongoing one. And so my focus now isn't on really speculating on who did this terrible thing, but hopefully encouraging people, investors, visitors, to continue to keep Thailand in their hearts and in their minds. Thailand has been a tremendous success story this last, decade or two. And in the last couple of years, we've gone through many difficult things here. From floods to protests to a coup, martial law, and now this terrible incident. But Thailand continues to be a terrific hub for manufacturing, a terrific hub for connectivity to other parts of the Southeast Asian region. But clearly tremendous challenges, certainly in the short term, remain for Thailand.
All right. In your opinion, is life starting to return to normal in and around Bangkok?
I'd say not quite. Last night I had the chance, I live very close to the Erewhon Shrine, so I had the chance to walk by. Security is everywhere. I think that in some ways that is reassuring, but then the question remains, what are we securing against? And that's certainly the unknown. Investors, visitors, one thing they hate is uncertainty. And so I think that uncertainty remains in Thailand, and so it is far from business as usual here. But indeed, life does go on. I think already the Erewhon Shrine has reopened. Visitors, Thai people are back at that shrine, praying for those who unfortunately are no longer with us. But also, I'm sure, praying for a more hopeful future. And indeed, Thailand's future, I think, remains bright despite this difficult time that the country is going through.
All right, Curtis S. Chin in Bangkok, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In last week's Asia Brief, I mentioned that secular blogger Niloy Chakrabarti was murdered in his home in Bangladesh. He, in fact, was the fourth blogger killed this year there, and police this week announced that 5 members of a banned Islamic group have been arrested for their alleged involvement in 3 separate blogger murders. All appear to be tied to the banned Islamic extremist group Ansar Allah Bangla team. One of those arrested has dual citizenship with the United Kingdom and might have information on all 4 blogger murders. Even with these arrests, critics of the government and police feel the investigations are too slow. Some bloggers have actually stopped writing altogether in order to protect themselves. I would do anything but disclose my address and phone number to the police now. I believe if I do it, the information will be leaked to the Islamists in no time, said blogger Shakil Ahmed. Now, to the casual observer, that seems pretty extreme, but given that at least one blogger has been murdered while using a pen name and made no public mention of his address, leads some to conclude the police are in fact leaking information. Only law enforcement agencies have the technologies to uncover the real identity of an online activist using a pen name and his location, said one blogger. The government has come out in support of the police, saying it's their job to protect all citizens and to give the authorities adequate time to solve these murders. But some say the way police are acting worries them. Blogger Shakil said the recent comment by the Inspector General of Police on the blogger's writing and the Home Ministry officials' decision, as we have heard, to identify and arrest the people whose writings may hurt religious sentiments, add to their fear that the police are not taking a neutral stand. Perhaps the truest test of where the police stand on this particular issue will be on the follow-up of those in custody. When ASEAN members recently met, they issued a joint statement, noting that land reclamation efforts in the South China Sea have eroded trust and confidence, increased tensions, and may undermine peace, security, and stability. But they did so without mentioning China by name or acknowledging that even their own members are performing similar work in their exclusive economic zones. When U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry met with his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, he failed to get China to budge. Wang Yi said, for instance, what is to be stopped? As parties have different positions, what are the criteria for stopping? Who will set the specific criteria? There is no answer to these questions. That said, China still welcomes constructive suggestions from all countries on maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea. But such suggestions must be feasible and, more importantly, should not impose double standards. For the United States, the key issue has always been the freedom of navigation through what most of the world perceives as international waters. To date, there hasn't been a problem, but China's ambassador in the Philippines, Zhao Jianhua, indicated things, they may be changing. The ambassador said, freedom of navigation does not mean to allow other countries to intrude into the airspace or the sea, which is sovereign. No country will allow that. We say freedom of navigation must be observed in accordance with international law, no freedom of navigation for warships and airplanes. While the United States may not get riled up at land reclamation efforts in disputed territories, it will not sit idly by and be told it cannot fly its airplanes or sail its ships in areas it considers international, just because Beijing dictates it. Tianjin Air Flight 267 crashed Sunday, shortly before it was scheduled to land in Oxabil, Indonesia. It wasn't until Tuesday that search crews could reach the wreckage due to the rough terrain, and when they did, they reported that the plane was totally destroyed and that there were no survivors. Officials have found 53 of the 54 passengers and crew of the ill-fated plane at the time of this recording. In addition to those aboard, the plane was also carrying about $500,000 in government funds to be distributed to poor families. Unfortunately, this is the 14th serious incident for the airlines, which began operations in 1991. With its less than stellar safety record, Tianjin Air is banned from flying in European airspace. The Philippines is the most vocal critic of China's land reclamation efforts, having taken Beijing to the Court of Arbitration in The Hague. However, litigation hasn't stopped China from forcing Manila to beef up its military. Defense Secretary Voltaire Gazman said, "The goal of updating and modernizing our armed forces is a long and painstaking process. That means we have to be frugal and acquire reliable platforms at very reasonable costs, as allowed by our meager financial resources." Gazman is proposing a 25% increase to the defense budget, but not all of it will be going towards maritime resources. Unfortunately, there are internal problems to be addressed and preparations for potential natural disasters like typhoons and landslides, which are common. Since 2010, the Philippines has acquired 2 former U.S. Coast Guard cutters, 3 landing crafts, and 7 helicopters. But that is not nearly enough to go up against China. Manila is preparing for the delivery of 2 FA-50s from South Korea. A total of 12 have been ordered. The Philippine Air Force Chief Lieutenant General Jeffrey Delgado considered these transition aircrafts to fill the gap until Manila can afford more advanced jet fighters. But that isn't the only purchase the Philippines is eyeing. Navy Chief Vice Admiral Jesus Milan said the Navy is looking at submarines to protect its deep water and open coastlines. He noted their acquisition can happen for some time, but an office has been set up to develop the idea and may happen within the next 3 to 5 years. Also up for discussion is the acquisition of the Spider air defense missile system. It's an Israeli short and medium-range mobile air defense system. These are self-propelled, quick-action, and all-weather units that are deployed throughout the world. But with China continuously developing their military capability and able to sail beyond the first island chain, let's be frank, anything Manila does will be well behind the curve. 15,000. That's right, that's the number of people that have been arrested on suspicion of committing cybercrimes in China. Police have been investigating some 7,400 cases of digital crimes as part of a 6-month operation that included hacking, online fraud, and illegal sale of personal information. In fact, one person has reportedly been detained for exaggerating the death toll from the Tianjin explosions, and another for claiming her father died there. Given the extent that China commits cyber crimes abroad, the crackdown has more to do with Beijing wishing to control the virtual environment rather than policing illicit activity. It's no secret that if you work for a big company in South Korea or Japan, the work can be brutal for the stereotypical salaryman. Long hours, short vacations, and the expectation you become subservient to your employer are the norm. But this week, a story surfaced from Japan that takes things to a whole new level. According to Fuji TV, Miyuki Muto kicked 23-year-old part-time employee Haruhiko Masumoto dozens of times in the face, head, and abdomen in the parking lot around 10 p.m. on Sunday. Masumoto suffered severe internal hemorrhaging from both his lower abdomen and other parts of his body. Muto finally called the police around 3:50 in the morning, saying a violent argument had broken out between herself and a man and that the man had lost consciousness. Masumoto later died on Monday. Muto was quoted by police as saying that she had been berating Masumoto about his attitude at work when she got worked up and began assaulting him inside a station wagon. After he got out of the car, she kept kicking him. Even more bizarre in all of this, it's being reported that Muto's 22-year-old son was also at the scene. Now, this crime took place in Aichi Prefecture, and to be perfectly honest, I am appalled by the sense of entitlement Ms. Muto felt she had. There is never, absolutely ever, a reason for an employer to strike an employee over attitude or performance problems. The fact that she did signals a significant problem. That she continued beating him after he exited the vehicle is another sign of her malice. But for her to finally get around to calling the police nearly 6 hours after this all began indicates she cared absolutely nothing for the man she wound up killing. Muto needs to go away behind bars and be made an example of. If we look back to the South Korean nut rage incident, the world collectively shook their heads at Xiao Hyuna for her response and subsequent attempts to wiggle out of being held accountable. Japan needs to step up and send a very powerful message that this behavior is not acceptable. Furthermore, employees need to do their part and not just take it anymore. Everyone has rights, and you need to stand up for yourself. If someone raises a hand to you, defend yourself, and then extricate yourself from the situation. No job is worth being abused. No job is ever worth dying over. Two prominent leaders of Hong Kong's Occupy movement have been charged with illegal assembly. Alex Chow, the former leader of the Hong Kong Federation of Students, and Joshua Wong, the leader of the student group Scholarism, were both charged on Wednesday. Wong is also being charged with inciting others to gather for an illegal assembly and wrote on his Facebook page that he thought the charges were a joke and has had no regrets over his activities. The pair have been ordered to report to police headquarters on August 27th. Authorities also declined to confirm these charges, but noted that their investigations are still ongoing and more arrests could manifest. Here we go with one story that may have flown underneath your radar. An American gay couple are embroiled in a Thai legal battle for their daughter Carmen after the surrogate mother backed out of their agreement. If they were a mother and father like a normal parents under Thai culture, I would have no problem being a surrogate for them. If I had known they were a gay couple, I would have not done this for them, because in Thai culture, we don't have this kind of status, said the surrogate, Petita Kusangasang. Now, I have no idea what she's talking about. This is Thailand. I've been to the shows. In fact, Carmen's biological father, Gordon Lake, said the U.S. Embassy issued a consular report of birth abroad which certifies her as a U.S. citizen. Unfortunately, what's complicating matters is Thailand's new law, which came into effect this past July, which bans commercial surrogacy. The law was put into place after an Australian couple left behind a child with Down syndrome while taking the infant's twin sister. Thankfully, Mr. Lake and his partner do have a fighting chance at getting Carmen home. Under Section 56 of the new law, there's a temporary provision that takes the rights away from the surrogate mother and gives the parental rights to the intended parents. All parties are due back in court in October to resolve matters, but for now, Thai social media has offered up some support for the American couple. It is 2015. And you know what? I am still amazed at the amount of stupidity I see each and every day. Wumo, a syndicated cartoon published in Europe and the United States, recently released a cartoon portraying the 2015 Indonesian beach volleyball team as orangutans. Aside from the obvious issues of depicting female athletes as apes, the fact that Indonesia didn't even participate in this particular contest raises the question as to why Wolf and Morgenthaler thought it would be a good idea to create this particular cartoon, and an even better question is why the Boston Globe chose to run it. Now, I did reach out to the Boston Globe, but as of the recording of this podcast, they declined to comment. Indonesians understandably found the cartoon offensive. It even prompted Indonesia's foreign minister to discuss her disappointment to U.S. representatives, saying, quote, "This cartoon is proof that we need to encourage people-to-people contact to foster respect for one another," end quote. And you know what? She is absolutely right. There is absolutely nothing respectful about this cartoon. But is this cartoon racist, as some suggest? That's going to be a harder question to answer, since for many, it won't even register as being offensive, for the same reasons many Americans don't think that images of President Obama being depicted as a monkey are offensive. Many will pass this off as nothing more than a joke at the expense of Indonesians. However, I'm always amazed that many people these days will also become suddenly offended when Asian countries depict Caucasian foreigners as people with big noses. The bottom line in all this is that falling back and using disparaging caricatures says a lot more about you than it does the other person. Well, my friends, the podcast is winding down, and that means it's time once more to take a look at some of your comments from this previous week. First up, John Lee commenting on the DMZ blast. Here's the part that makes me furious. These soldiers who lost their legs, the Marines who were turned into pulverized meat, the sailors who were killed at sea, they have always been part of the plan. What I mean to say is that politicians know that North Korea acts out on occasion, and whenever they do that, South Korean soldiers die. But that's already been part of the plan, the cost of dealing with North Korea. A. Jake Preston also shared his thoughts on South Korea's response to the mine blast. The resumption of broadcast is pretty lame. It reaches only the hardcore trusted border soldiers and not the people likely to be swayed. Cross-border balloons from NGOs have much more effect than this. Yet again, the rock has shown itself toothless and unprepared to respond in a meaningful way. William Cho summed things up this way. There is really only two options. Not strike back or take down the government. Sending a few missiles to kill a few North Koreans only plays into the hands of the regime who will survive because they claim to exist to protect from the evil West. On Uber's woes in Asia, Matt Vieira said, "Business regulations aren't keeping up with the dynamic nature of technology." Very well put. That is exactly it. My hometown of Providence, Rhode Island, is trying to implement a tax on Uber right now. When I visited Austin, Texas, Uber wasn't allowed to pick up people from the airports, only taxis. 69 Phuket shared these thoughts on the debris found on Reunion Island. They could have cut it up a year ago and dumped the parts, knowing it would be encrusted in barnacles and washed up on a French-held beach. Funny how the smaller interior stuff hasn't showed up. This is not closure, in my opinion. Number 0221 said this about South Korea's plan for the Trans-Asian Railway. I agree with you on this one. What a waste of money. President and her advisors are retarded. Red White Dude added, an irrational decision on the part of South Korea due to some emotional attachment and reunification hope. Kimchi King doesn't think South Korea and other nations have a skewed perception of Japan, saying, I don't think it's skewed. Members of Western militaries who fought in Asia and suffered under Japanese culture still hate Japan today. Half of Asia suffered under Japan, from Korea across China over to Burma and down to Singapore. While the generation that suffered is still alive, it is harsh to dismiss their distrust of former persecutors as pathetic. The best thing to solve it is for Japan to apologize unequivocally for its war crimes like Germany did decades ago. Speaking of Japan's need to apologize for World War II, Tariq said, it is not a soccer game. I mean, it is not a game where one side just apologizes more and wins. Of course, Japan did apologize multiple times, and they were sincere. But do the Poles think Merkel's opinion will not last if the regime changes? Every day now, on the international news section, there is a random Japanese minister of parliament saying, guys, you know what? Come to think about it, we were not that bad. In my opinion, gotta get full-fledged armory and nuclear weapons. Problem? And it's not just a petty neo-Nazi party that gets less than 10% turnout. Oh no, it's the LDP with financial nepotism and more than a third of parliament. Do they want an impunity from their sins or what? Sungmin Lee also on Japan's apology. There was news this morning about the ruling party of Japan forming a committee to review the ruling by the International Court regarding the war crimes committed by the Japanese leaders during World War II. The current Japanese leaders seem to think that the ruling was unfair. Regardless of the sufficiency of an apology, without the proper actions to back that up, the apology does not mean anything. And finally, 10,000 Years had this to say on China's actions. For thousands of years, until the mid-Qing and the later Opium Wars, China was arguably one of the most advanced, sophisticated civilizations in the world, and the largest in terms of both economy and population. During the 19th and 20th century, the low point, China had to fight against Western colonialism. then Japanese imperialism, then U.S. imperialism. Now we see China not emerging as a great superpower, but re-emerging. It is no surprise that China is starting to use its growing power to strengthen its global position. It is inevitable, therefore, to have China and the United States, including American allies, coming to some sort of confrontation. After all, this is what the United States has been shamelessly doing for the past 70 years. Therefore, I think that yes, Beijing is attempting to reclaim past glory. However, it is no different, or if anything far less serious than American aggression and its attempted global domination. And yet, being so influenced by the Western world, we see no problem with this. Thank you again to everyone who took the time to leave a message this past week. I truly do appreciate it. And if you have a thought or an opinion, please share them with me, either in the comments, on Facebook, or Twitter. If you enjoyed this week's podcast, please share it with your friends. And if you haven't, subscribe. Subscribing is free and easy to do. Just go to our website, asianewsweekly.net, and click on the subscribe tab. You can also subscribe in your favorite podcast application like iTunes or Stitcher, and when you subscribe, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. Now, if you want to keep up with more news from the region, be sure to follow Asia News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And of course, if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, you can email me at podcast@asianewsweekly.net. Well, my friends, that's all the time I have this week. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Steve Miller, and until next time, be true to yourself and always be awesome.